Dracula was unleashed on the world over 125 years ago, but there are some tales of the undead that are even older than Bram Stoker's masterpiece, some by over a century. Let's check them out. Hey everyone, welcome to D3 Reads. Thanks so much for joining. If you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, please do so. We talk everything science fiction, fantasy, and horror here, and we'd love for you to join the conversation. So like, subscribe, and let's get started. I've mentioned a number of times that one of my favorite types of horror stories are vampire stories. I even have a video that I posted last year that suggested some of the best vampire books in my opinion. And if you've watched that video or any of my other videos where we talk about vampires, you might remember that I have some pretty strict rules about what makes a good vampire story. They're irredeemably evil, and they're not just humans that have light sensitivity and a thirst for blood, right? They're not looking for boyfriends and girlfriends. I was doing some research for this. I did a search on vampire stories, and some of the top returns were vampire romance. That's not what I think of as a good vampire story. Now, if you like that, more power to you. I'm not knocking your preference, but to me, a good vampire story has nothing to do with just superpowered humans who are tempted to drink blood. These are irredeemably evil creatures that are out to spread vampirism and maybe create some slaves or what have you, but vampires are not sympathetic characters. They can be tragic, but they're not sympathetic characters. Now, obviously, Bram Stoker's Dracula is the ultimate vampire. He's the ultimate villain. Published in 1897, I think it's really amazing to think about the staying power that Dracula has. It's shaped horror as we know it, and it shaped Hollywood and mass media and all that kind of stuff. It's amazing that for over 125 years, Dracula is still so very popular. But Bram Stoker based his vampire on works that predated him, in some cases, by over 100 years. And I'm not just talking about fairy tales and lore and that kind of thing. I'm talking about some truly, legitimately creepy literature that was out there well before he was born. So let's take a few minutes and talk about some of these older vampire stories that helped inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. So the first couple of the stories that we're going to go over aren't actually short stories or novellas, they're poems. But please don't go anywhere. I promise you, if you stick around, bear with me, you'll find that these stories are actually quite creepy. Now, one of the things about these next couple of tales that we're going to go over is that at first they appear to violate one of my rules about vampire stories, which is no romance. But at the heart of each of these next couple of stories is human love. But when you take a look at them, you see very, very quickly that the love in these stories is either twisted, one-sided, or malevolent deception. Now, the first story is called Der Vampyr, which is German for the vampire, and is published in 1748 by a man by the name of Heinrich August Ossenfelder. Now, this is a very short poem, and I'm going to link as many of these stories as I can on in the description here, because a lot of these are so old. They're on Project Gutenberg or on various websites out there, and I'm going to link you to these. I'm going to provide the link to those stories in the description. But The Vampire is a very short poem that's surprisingly creepy. And what's interesting about this is it appears to be a story about a vampire or a man that transforms into a vampire by the end of the two verses that are in this poem, who is, it sounds like he's courting a young woman, but the young woman is having nothing to do with him because her mother has warned her, has taught her, raised her, instructed her about things. And one of them is that the undying vampires are not to be trifled with. And so having acknowledged that this young woman that he seems to be infatuated with is listening to his mother, he then turns and says that he's basically going to creep up into her room at night while she's asleep, drain her life from her, and then she'll get a chance to see that his instruction is far more valuable than his mother's, and that's it. It's just this small snapshot of the mind of the undead, right? That this creature, what is kind of portrayed as a sort of twisted love story. And so in this case, it's not a sparkling vampire who's looking for companionship. It's someone who is it's more of a thirst for a companion or what have you, but it's not love, right? It's more of a power thing, right? It's not love, it's domination. And so I think in these couple of verses, it's just, I think, a fantastic short vampire story. And the fact that it was written in 1748, well, or about 150 years before Dracula, I just I just think it's kind of amazing. So Der Vampyr by Heinrich August Ossenfelder, very cool little story, a very cool little poem. Check it out. I think you'll find it perfect for reading for Halloween. Now, next up is a longer poem, more like a ballad called Lenore, published in 1773 by a man named Gottfried August Bürger. And this one is kind of cheating and kind of not. You see, ultimately, the story it smells all the world like a vampire story, and it is a supernatural horror tale. But when you get to the end of it, you find that it's not a vampire. It's more like the Grim Reaper or the Specter of Death or something along those lines. But everything about it sounds like a vampire. Talking about what you have here is a woman who is just heartbroken because her betrothed has gone off to war and has been gone for a long time, and she's just completely upset because she thinks that he's either dead or run off with someone. And then he comes to her in the night and says, we need to get married, and we're going to travel 100 miles by horse to get to the wedding, to get to the marriage, to get to the marriage ceremony. And you know right away that something's not right because you're not riding 100 miles at night anyway. But the thing is just really creepy, and a haunting series of refrains that goes throughout this poem. One of the famous, or one of the repeated lines in here is, "For the dead ride fast," and that line is actually quoted in Dracula. So even though it's not technically a vampire story, it had a hand in inspiring Bram Stoker's vision for the King of the Vampires, Dracula. So Lenore, it's a longer story. Again, I think it was written in German originally, but it really is I mean, read it and you'll see that it has all the elements of good, creepy vampire stories. And once again, it's kind of based in love, but in this case, what happened, there's love is used to lure poor Lenore in. She's so angry that her husband to be has vanished at the beginning, that she essentially blames God, and she's turning her back on God. And so what you have here is kind of the ramifications of that in this story. So not technically a vampire story, but it's inspired vampire stories. And again, the tone of it, you're going through here, you could very well convince yourself that this is actually a vampire that poor Lenore is having to deal with. So Lenore by Gottfried August Bürger, creepy poem, ballad, definitely worth your time reading this Halloween. Number 3 is another poem slash ballad. It's shorter than Lenore, called The Bride of Corinth. And this was published about 100 years before Dracula in 1797, written by Goethe himself. The Bride of Corinth, again, based in love. This is kind of a neat story because what you have is a young man who I think he's traveled from Greece, and he is courting. He's come to court a woman that he's somehow fallen in love with, a young woman he's somehow fallen in love with, but the mother doesn't want anything to do with them because they're pagan. The boy and his family are pagan, whereas the young woman and her family are Christian. And so she's essentially whisked her daughter away. Now, you find this out throughout the poem, and I'm not going to give away all of it, but basically the young daughter that the young man has come to marry has been put away into a nunnery or something like that. And she is instead going to marry off another daughter to this young pagan. But the bride of Corinth, the young woman who is supposed to be betrothed, that the young man's come to marry, the bride of Corinth, she winds up dying of grief or something like that. I don't know, but she comes to visit him in the night after having died. And what happens next is chilling because as you're reading it, and I was a little surprised because again, I was convinced that the whole love angle and romance angle of vampirism wasn't going to exist in this. And here I'm reading the story and I'm thinking, wow, this is like a love story with, beyond the grave, but it's not. Don't be fooled. By the time the story wraps up, you think, wow, that's some cold-hearted stuff. That is a really, really cool old tale of vampires, and I think it is a perfect example of how insidious and evil vampires are, and they're not to be trifled with. They're not going to be your next boyfriend or girlfriend. So check that one out. Next up is a short story also called The Vampyr, and it was published in 1819 by John William Palidori. Now, Palidori is the physician who, if you heard the story about the writing or the genesis of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley and Lord Byron and Palidori and some other folks, they kind of sequestered themselves away in this manor in Switzerland or something during a stormy weekend, and they wound up challenging each other to write a story of the paranormal, and Mary Shelley winds up producing Frankenstein. Well, I guess Lord Byron produced a story dealing with a vampire or something vampiric, and this gentleman, Palidori, winds up taking that idea and writing this story called The Vampire. And it's a pretty solid vampire story. There are so many good, creepy elements to it. The vampire is a nobleman, high aristocracy type of guy named Lord Ruthven, I think his name is, and he's kind of a mystery. He kind of shows up out of nowhere and immediately kind of becomes part of the noble knight scene, I guess, all the parties and all that kind of stuff. But he's kind of standoffish in some ways, and women throw themselves at him. But they mention how he just doesn't seem, there's not much going on behind the eyes there. He just kind of can see through you, but also not seem to even be connecting with you. It's kind of a neat description. You can tell right away that there's just something not right about this guy. Then you also are introduced to another guy named Aubrey. And Aubrey is a young man who is, because his parents passed away, they were wealthy. He kind of grew up with abundance, and he's finally old enough to kind of go around and travel on his own. And anyway, they wind up traveling together into Europe, and Aubrey starts realizing that there's something sinister about Ruthven. And so eventually he gets word that, hey, this guy's no good. He's basically preying on young women. And it says that he's basically, they kind of imply that he's doing something awful, but they don't say what. So they kind of, lend you to believe that he's, like violating them or what have you. But turns out that's not exactly the case, as you'll see. And then Aubrey takes off because he doesn't want to be around him anymore and goes to Greece, where he meets a young woman who is kind of a guide because he's doing some archaeology kind of work and just checking out the monuments in Greece. And the young woman is a native, and he just falls in love with her because she's so beautiful. And even though she's not exactly the high-minded type, the aristocracy type, he just finds her just fascinating, and he falls in love with her. But she believes in vampires, and she tells him that about the legend of vampires, and he laughs, but she gets really upset. She's like, look, you can't do that, because anytime someone doesn't take this seriously, they're forced to believe by some tragedy. And her parents also get in on this, and they all warn him, don't laugh at the vampires. And so things happen, tragedy happens, and I'm not going to ruin the story for you, but basically vampirism follows him to a tragic end. Now, I will admit two things. One is the story is hard to read at first. When you're reading this story, I know I had to reread the first couple of paragraphs a couple of times because the wording is archaic, and I wasn't quite sure I was getting it. But then after about, I don't know, a quarter of the way through, maybe it's just by practice, it started clicking, and then it became a lot easier to read. So it was hard getting started at first, but it's worth it. Keep reading it, and the ending is kind of just sudden. and it's not exactly the most satisfying ending in my opinion, but it's well worth your time. It's a classic, you know, is written, as I say, in 1819, and it's clear that this vampire, I don't know if it's specifically inspired Dracula, but you can tell that they're borrowing from a lot of the same legends. So very much worth your time reading, I think. It's not particularly long. I read it at Project Gutenberg. And be aware, if you follow the link I'm going to give you, there's a lot of kind of preface where it describes how some of the ideas were come together, and you kind of get fooled and think you're reading the story. You're not. Scroll down to where you get to the actual story. But yeah, Palidori's the Vampire is fun to read and definitely got a solid place in vampire literature. Next up, I think, is the first actual short novella-length story that I'm aware of dealing with vampires, and that's 1823's Wake Not the Dead by Ernest Ropach. Now, I've talked about this in my favorite vampire stories before because this, again, it's a complete story. It's very much a chilling vampire tale. There's a little bit of kind of in-your-face kind of moral to it. So be ready for that. But it still is a lot of fun to read. In this story, there's a nobleman who is married to love of his life, and she passes away. And he's just heartbroken, devastated by it. But eventually he tries to move on. He marries another woman. They have kids. But then he starts pining for his first wife. And he starts getting depressed and morose. And he's wandering out at nights just trying to, grieve something that he's lost. And he winds up in the cemetery. And he's at his first wife's grave. And he meets a sorcerer. And the sorcerer somehow winds up telling him that, yeah, I can bring back the dead, but wake not the dead. He keeps warning, wake not the dead. But this guy's like, this nobleman, he just says, you got to help me. And so the sorcerer does. And he wakes his wife. And his wife is not what he was expecting. And what happens from then on out to towards the end is just, I think, it's outright evil. Here he's gotten kind of what he asked for, but what he receives isn't exactly his wife. And that's, to me, is the real terror of vampirism, where this evil force that looks like your loved ones, when it's not your loved one anymore. And so yeah, Wake Not the Dead. It was a lot of fun to read. Again, the ending I felt was it almost seemed like Ropach wasn't sure exactly how to wrap it up, and it kind of is a little jarring, I think, but and kind of out of place. But for the most part, this story is a lot of fun and creepy, and definitely a good Halloween read. Not particularly long, too, so you can still fit it in for spooky season. Wake Not the Dead. And finally, I think, is the best of them all, and this one came out probably about 25 years before Dracula, which is Carmilla, published in 1872 and written by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. This one, I think, is just the vampire. Everything about this is pretty close to perfect as far as old vampire stories. Yes, it's a little wordy, I think, a little bit the poetic writing can kind of drag it down a little bit as far as the tempo, but the story is top notch, and the creature in here is definitely creepy and worth your time. In the story, it's kind of told from the perspective of a young girl named Laura, and she and her husband, she and her father, excuse me, they live out in this rural area, I think, of Bulgaria. And they live in a manor, small castle, what have you. And they end up seeing what looks like an accident. A carriage kind of crashes near their home. And they go to rescue, to find out if they can help. And they find an old woman and her daughter, her young daughter, Camilla. And Carmilla is knocked out cold. And basically, the mother comes up with an excuse. She says, look, I got to get to this place, and my daughter can't make it, because could you please take care of her, and I'll be back here in a couple of weeks. I can't tell you what I'm doing. It's super secret, but you take care of Carmilla, and I'll be back, and I'll repay you. And, of course, the father, being a generous guy, says, sure, we will. And they bring Carmilla into the household, and then things get dark from there. It's just a really cool story. It's got so many elements of mystery mystery and creepiness and the vampire lore that's kind of in here. Some of it lines up with what you see in Bram Stoker's work. Some of it is kind of, I think, more the superstitious peasant kind of things that didn't quite make it into more creepy literature, but still, it's so much fun to read. So Carmilla, I think, is probably one of the best of the stories and worth your time reading. It's a great vampire tale. That's it, guys. That's the 6 vampire tales that are older than Bram Stoker's Dracula. There's more out there, I know. I haven't read them all, so let me know if you know of any older vampire stories, whether it's a poem, whether it's a short story, novella, what have you. I would love to check them out. Plus, tell me what you're reading this spooky season. And thanks so much for your time, guys. Have a great day.